Here we go. We are back. Happy Monday to everybody. Is that what I want to say? Welcome to the Infertility Feelings Podcast. I am Jessie Brown and...
I am Doug Brown, and we are back with our best friend in the whole world, Dr.
Yep.
Andrea Ganahl.
Yes.
Call me Annie.
Yeah, Annie.
We are back with Annie.
We are so glad that you are here.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I
Yes.
love being with you guys.
Oh,
Thank
you're
you.
the best.
Today we have a really light topic.
Yeah. Just
Today
a
we're
little-
talking about infertility and trauma.
Yes. And everything that goes with it. For me, let's just dive right into it, I guess.
Yeah.
For me, I feel like what I realized that I may have been going through. Wait, do you want to define trauma first, or do you want me to share my story of trauma?
I want you to share your story, because
Okay.
if we talk about infertility, feelings, trauma feels like it's a category of feelings, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Annie, you'll teach us more, but I think there are stories that we each have, and Jessie and you and I have stories in our own life, and we've heard stories from people that feel like, wow, that's more than just a normal everyday feeling, right? Tell us the story, Jessie.
Yeah, I remember the first time I thought, "Oh, this is a bigger deal," one of the hardest things that I've ever gone through.
Infertility is?
Struggling with infertility,
Yeah.
was my reactions didn't fit what happened. They were bigger than what was actually going on. And I will never forget running late to an IVF appointment to get my blood drawn. And we were driving down the 5 freeway, because we live in Southern California, down the 5 freeway. And you would have thought that we were running late to win $1 million or something. That's how scared and how much fear I felt of being late. And I remember feeling, wow, this is a bigger deal, and this reaction does not fit. Because I remember just looking at you, and how I expressed my anger was I told you everything that had bugged me in the last 7 years of our marriage, which was not right. And then I ended up feeling guilty, and it was just really hard. But I remember...
Right, because we were 5 minutes late.
Because we were 5 minutes late. And the reason we were late wasn't even my fault, too. So it was it just was all that. And we were going to an IVF blood test that was going to give us results that we needed.
Right.
You know what I mean? But I remember, I feel like when I started to realize how traumatic infertility was how I expressed my emotions. They didn't fit. I stubbed my toe and it would be like I broke my leg. It just didn't fit with what was actually going on. Does that make sense?
That makes total sense. Because I felt the same way. It felt like normal things became totally unnormal in the way that I reacted to them.
Yeah.
Is that when you started to feel like infertility is something you've never gone through before? Did it feel more than stressful?
Yes. It was one of the hardest things I've ever gone through in my life. And I feel like it was... Wait, what are you asking?
Are there moments where you're like, this isn't normal? This feels like it's not just a normal stressful thing that I'm going through. This feels like something traumatic. Did you feel like you could categorize it like that when you were going through it?
Yes. Yes.
What's one of those moments?
Driving down the 5 freeway at that moment. I was like, uh-oh.
Your reaction?
Fit. Yeah.
Your experience of your reaction to what you were going through was traumatic?
Yes. It was the most... I feel like I am the same kind of person. I feel like you can always see me cracking jokes, always happy. And I feel like I'm genuinely like that in every area of my life.
Right.
And in that season, I've never been more angry, more irritable, more edgy, more aggressive. And sometimes I can be aggressive.
You're a little
Just
aggressive.
yeah.
In a good way.
Just depends.
A loving aggressive.
Yeah, a loving aggressive. And I was not loving aggressive. I would not say that. So I think that was...
Right.
So, that is a memory that we like to laugh about now,
Yeah.
but in the moment it wasn't. But I feel like that's when I knew that something was really going on. It was a drastic change in my personality, if you will, or how I typically would behave, was how I realized, this is a bigger deal than anything I've ever experienced before.
Right. So Annie, is it possible to say that infertility is traumatic? Because I think I hear it. We see it online, right?
Yeah.
People say it, but I don't know if I felt like I could have said that when I was going through infertility. I don't know if I would have said, I'm experiencing something traumatic. Maybe in a flippant way, oh, this is so traumatic, I don't know if I really thought about what that meant. Can you give us an outline of what does it mean to go through something traumatic And can we call infertility traumatic?
I believe you definitely can call it traumatic. I mean, everyone's different and everyone responds to stress differently. I would say for the majority of infertile couples, and again, depending on what they've been through, obviously if you've had a miscarriage or if you've been doing it for many years, there's different levels of infertility stress.
Yeah.
I think there's other factors that determine if it's traumatic, but I would say for the majority of people, it is a traumatic experience. They've actually done research that found that people that miscarry is similar to someone who's come home from war. It's there's that kind of response. And it's a year later, they found that those responses are still in a similar category. So it's very traumatic for some.
Because when I think of trauma, war is the most classic thing that you think of, bombs going off over your head and you have that like post-traumatic stress trauma, but you're saying something like a miscarriage can be just as traumatic.
Right. Now, I do want to say that PTSD, just because you have trauma does not mean you're going to have PTSD. So I want to make sure we separate the two.
Right.
Even people that have been through war, for example, only 30% of people who've been through serious trauma develop PTSD.
Wow. Interesting.
So I just want to make sure that just because you're experiencing infertility and therefore possibly trauma does not mean that you have PTSD or will develop PTSD.
Okay.
Right. So you can, for sure. But I want to make sure that we put it in the context.
Yeah. Do you find that people throw that around when they maybe might not mean it or maybe it might not be true?
They throw around that they have PTSD?
Yeah.
I don't think people really understand what PTSD is.
Right.
It's possible. I don't know if I do.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, there's certain criteria you have to meet to get that diagnosis. And so, yes, I do think it's thrown around.
Okay.
Because a psychologist or a therapist, licensed therapist, that's who can diagnose you with that. You can't just assume, I must have it. There is very specific criteria you have to have, and we can go over that if you want.
Right.
But I think what's important for our conversation is that, yes, infertility can definitely be a traumatic experience for people. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to understand that, because if we understand that it possibly is traumatic, we're going to have a little bit more empathy for ourselves. We're going to have a little bit more understanding of what we're going through. Yeah. I think sometimes, my experience, I can tell you with infertility was, why is this so hard? Why am I so overwhelmed with this process? And I felt like something was wrong with me because it felt so big. Mm-hmm. And so learning that it can be a traumatic experience and that it's a very significant stress for many people normalized my reaction. And that's why I think it's important to talk about it, that it definitely can be traumatic.
Yeah.
How would you define trauma?
Trauma would be, in my own words, something that's very distressful, an event that's very distressful that creates a lot of emotion and reaction, physically, mentally, emotionally. And so you're going to see a lot of symptoms, if you will, when you have a traumatic experience. There's going to be, it's going to be more than a stressful event. It's going to be a significant, stressful experience.
And how do you know?
I would say that's infertility.
Yeah,
exactly.
Ding, ding, ding,
I
ding,
feel
ding.
like that could be everyone who's experienced infertility, but how do you know? Like, when could you say that about yourself, that I'm experiencing a traumatic event?
So I would say it probably is the majority of people. However, I never will say all, because that's putting everyone in that's gone through infertility in a box, and you can't do that.
Right.
I agree.
And also, it's important to remember that trauma does not mean PTSD. So we have to remember that, because I think so many people put those two words together.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, no, it's not. Infertility is not traumatic, because it's not. You haven't been in war and watched your best friend die.
Right.
So trauma is just something that you go through that is not a normal situation, and that it's very difficult and very stressful.
Yeah. So would it be right to think of it like a continuum?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So there's a continuum. And again, everyone reacts differently. So this was interesting. They did a study on people who all experienced a similar trauma. For example, a natural disaster. 9/11 would be another example, right? Yeah. So many of us saw things that we wish we hadn't seen.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so they did a study and tried to figure out, why did some people respond and develop PTSD and some people didn't. And so they did all this amazing work. I love research.
Yeah.
And they found that there were certain things that people had in their lives that helped them not develop PTSD. Now, and we're talking about people, we're not talking about people like us who watched it on TV. We're talking about people who were actually involved.
Who witnessed it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that kind of shows you the continuum that for some people, a stressful event like infertility I'm gonna put a number to it just for our own so visual, 1 to 10. 10 being, the most horrific event you can think of. There's a continuum of, some of us have experienced a level 1 trauma, some of us experienced level 8 trauma. Most everyone has experienced some kind of trauma, whether it's in your childhood, whether it's, something you actually experienced or something you observed that someone else experienced. Once you can actually have secondary trauma, which is when you hear from someone else about their trauma.
Wow.
Which therapists are very vulnerable for secondary trauma because, if you're working with people that deal with trauma. And so, yes, there's definitely a continuum. And I think, personally, I think that if you feel you've gone through trauma, you've gone through trauma.
Yeah.
If you experience it as traumatic, then it is going through a trauma.
Right. What would be something like in your daily life that you would maybe feel? Maybe that's a hard question, but like to feel and be like, oh, I think I'm experiencing trauma, or this is a bigger deal.
What are the symptoms?
Yeah, symptoms.
Okay, so there's emotional, which would be, and again, there's such an array.
Right.
We kind of talked about this a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right.
And so you would have sadness, you would have anxiety, you could have being totally feeling overwhelmed.
Right.
You could have rage. So there's so many different emotions.
I think that's what you had, Jesse, is rage. That's
on
what
the 5 freeway. A lot of people experience rage on the 5 freeway.
Not the kind of rage I was feeling. More towards.
I experienced the rage.
Yeah.
Is it those emotions go like overboard? They boil over? Is that
they can? I don't think that's necessary to understand that you have trauma.
Okay.
Okay. So you have these emotions, and yes, they feel bigger than normal.
Yeah.
Then you have the thinking process.
Right.
Now, for a traumatic experience, for a lot of times, maybe it's a one-time event. So let's say you did IVF and it didn't work. So there's a traumatic experience for a lot of people.
Right.
You would have you might be thinking about that over and over and over again. So for the whole month, you're thinking about that day, getting that result, and how devastating that was. You might have nightmares. You might, struggle with your sleep because you keep remembering those words from the doctor, or you keep remembering, or a miscarriage. You can imagine how very traumatic experience, and that you would relive it and relive it. That is definitely. I have a
memory of alcohol pads. That's something that's my trauma is alcohol pads, because when you did the shots, you would always put an alcohol pad. So now whenever I smell an alcohol pad, I'm like, oh, like I get like a reaction of like, oh my gosh, that reminds me of infertility. That reminds me of going through IUI and IVF is the smell of alcohol in the pad when you clean, like a cleaning pad.
So let's talk after the
podcast. Okay, yes. Annie, me and you can have our own private session.
That's definitely a trigger. And that's something, what's so, I love just the whole psychology stuff, is that you can get immune to that, by not avoiding it, by actually going towards the alcohol pads and really having that be a part of your exposure. You can have exposure to that and actually have that go away.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So, so you're going to have certain things like that, nightmares. You're going to kind of relive that experience. You're going to have lack of concentration, possibly. There's a lot of the feelings that we talked about. Lack of concentration is more of a reaction, thinking-wise. You might have some behaviors like acting out.
I have no idea how that
is. Maybe you start drinking more, or maybe you start doing things you normally wouldn't do. Kind of what you described. Really, is that you're not yourself, and that you're feeling a lot of emotion,
right?
And you're overwhelmed by it,
right?
That's an indication that this is much bigger than just a stressful event,
right?
And so,
and I remember feeling that when I did that on the 5 freeway, I remember feeling that. But when I really, really felt it and went back was after we stopped. After we stopped doing IVF and we had our egg, we only had one egg at the end of IVF, and then it didn't work. I remember then it was like, oh, like looking back. So it's like, I think that's why sometimes I mean, we encourage people to like take breaks and stuff like that, because then I think you can like be like, oh, what we just went through was really hard. But sometimes it's like, and we even did that a little bit with adoption of like, let's just keep going and I'll be hyper-focused over here, you know, but it's like, interesting.
Yeah. I feel for me, there is a moment I think that I can think of that I feel like went beyond stressful and went into traumatic. And I think that was the moment when we were waiting for our call to find out if our transfer had worked and if we were pregnant or not. And
where did we go, Doug? What did we do that day?
What did we do? I don't know.
We went to Disneyland.
Oh yeah.
Disneyland couldn't even distract us. I was a mess.
Yeah. The happiest place on earth wasn't even distracting enough.
Nope.
But I remember waiting for that phone call, and it feels traumatic because of the amassing attention that I was putting on that moment. I was waiting. I was over analyzing it. I was thinking about it nonstop. I couldn't sleep. It was all those things that you're talking about. And then you get that phone call, and then the second we picked up, we knew it was bad. The tone of the voice and all of that. And then hanging up and just having you be completely wrecked, me completely wrecked. That feels like a traumatic moment because Absolutely. It just sticks so clearly in my head, and it dictated so much of what I acted like and did for honestly years after that. It was so painful and felt so trapping, and I think traumatic things have an element of feeling trapped. And I felt so trapped in that moment. I felt trapped between our desire to have a child and our inability to have a child. So it was like this push and pull that I couldn't get away from. It was like I wanted to have this for our family, and we couldn't get this for our family. So that moment felt traumatic. That moment felt like it was traumatizing, which led us into years of making, perfectly honest, making, the kids that we've brought into our house are all brilliant and beautiful and wonderful, but all the situations that led up to that, the financial decisions we made, all of that felt like it came out of that moment of feeling trapped. I felt trapped that I wanted this family and couldn't have it. So I just did anything like extreme behavior, right? Kind of, and it isn't in trauma. We kind of have that fight, flight, or freeze. I was just in a fight mentality, and I was a warrior charging on, and I would do anything, which didn't feel healthy when I was doing it.
And I feel like husbands can fall into that.
Yeah, maybe that's a common thing.
Well, they still want to fix it.
Yes, they want to fix it. And I feel like for you saw me hurting and you were like, I want to fix that. I want to take away that pain. And then I'm going to avoid my pain of like, I'll just keep charging on and keep going. Yeah. And it led us to not so good. I remember we went through a season of like, we're sad. Let's just buy it. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like we even did that, like just walking through Target. It's like, well, we just had, our second like failed adoption. Let's just buy this $400 vacuum. You know what I mean? Like
we did that. We actually did that.
Yeah. We still call it our sad vacuum.
Our sadness vacuum.
Our sadness vacuum. Because it's like, well, we were really sad when we bought that. But it's like, and those were just almost small things.
Yeah. But I think it adds up to that moment. I felt trapped by my reality in that moment. So
out of control. Yeah. And therefore we tend to try to seek control, right? When the whole fight, flight, or freeze is you in something like this, you could run, but you don't typically run. Yeah. And so you don't want to freeze. Right. And so you want to fight. And what does that look like? Well, what are you going to fight over? You're it didn't work. A lot of times we start acting out in ways to kind of try to release some of that tension that's built up because of this intense emotional event. And so then you start seeing acting out behavior that may or may not look like acting out behavior, but maybe irresponsible or
$400 vacuum.
Yeah.
And what a weird trauma that infertility is that because it seems to trap you in such a weird way, it doesn't let go of you because you want it, right? Like we want the family that we want, the children that we want. So like it like brings us back, like we bring ourselves back to these traumatic situations.
Well, and I think too, infertility is unique, a unique trauma because it And even if you have a child, it's
correct.
still,
Right.
it's an ongoing situation. It's not like you were sexually assaulted and you have to process that experience and, you kind of just work towards dealing with something that's back here in the past.
Right.
Infertility is past, current, and present, or it would be past, current, and present, right? That you're still going through it. And even if you have a child, if you haven't processed the emotion, you really are still living with it.
Right.
100%.
And
We've seen that so much.
I think it's fascinating. We couldn't go to the doctor until 12. We were struggling with infertility for 12 months. So like we're walking in the door, not like, hey, this might be hard. We're like, we're dying. We finally get to be here.
Right. Right.
So we started the process.
Yeah.
Trauma.
I have a question. Doug and I have dug into a lot of our trauma and felt a lot of things. And we have kids that have a lot of trauma. So we are very comfortable with the flight, or freeze. How would you explain that to someone who is newly trying to get in touch with their trauma of like, what is fight, flight, or freeze?
Okay, so technical stuff. I love this stuff, actually.
Good.
Okay, so in our brain, we have something called the amygdala, which is the size of an almond.
Oh.
And so whenever we're afraid, the amygdala is what creates the fight, flight, or freeze. It triggers this fight, flight, or freeze response. And the whole purpose of it is so that if we're in true danger, our bodies are prepared, right?
Right.
Our muscles tense up, our breathing changes, our heart races, our pupils dilate, and then we actually get a whole flood of cortisol, which is a stress hormone, to help us run.
Right.
Really, that's to prepare us for a fight.
That's like you see
flight.
a bear in the woods, right?
Correct.
Got it.
So that's the fight or flight. And freeze was just added. It actually wasn't, used to be the fight or flight, and then they've added freeze.
That's right.
Because there's sometimes a need for freezing.
Right.
If you saw a rattlesnake, for example.
Right.
Right.
So now I forget what I was going with that.
And I think
so the amygdala.
Yes.
Okay. So the amygdala gets triggered.
You froze.
almond.
Exactly. The almond shape in the middle of our brain.
Yeah.
It gets triggered. And that's the only way we experience anxiety is if the amygdala is stimulated. And when the amygdala is stimulated, guess what happens?
We have anxiety.
Our frontal cortex, our thinking brain, starts to get affected.
Huh.
So the stronger the amygdala is being stimulated, the more we lose ability in our prefrontal cortex, which is our thinking brain, which is our decision making. So when we're in the fight, flight, or freeze, we aren't thinking very clearly, right? Because now it doesn't matter what you're thinking. What matters is that you can run or fight.
Right.
Huh.
So what we need to do is we need to get in touch with, as best as possible, our thinking brain so we can make a good decision. Now, if there's a bear that comes in the rooms, I don't care what anyone's thinking.
It's
run.
like reaction, right? Yeah,
right.
react.
Save your life and run.
Yeah.
But normally, right, that we don't live where there's bears.
Yeah, no, we don't.
And it's rare that we're in really serious physical danger, right? Most of the time, it's emotional danger. We're afraid of emotional pain, or we're the cognitive distortions that we talked about a couple weeks ago, where we're not really thinking clearly.
Right.
So the fight, flight, or freeze is in the center of our brain in order to keep us alive. If you think about the olden days when people hunted for their food, they needed to have a really good, strong sense of danger. And, that's what kept you alive.
Right.
We don't need that as much, but unfortunately, we're constantly using it because we are a society that's filled with anxiety. And so when something gets triggered that stimulates the amygdala, because it's triggered something probably from the past that scared you, whether it be physically or emotionally. And so we oftentimes are experiencing fight, flight, or freeze because, like the alcohol pad, right? That you've connected your trauma of infertility with the alcohol pad. And that's a trigger now. And just like probably your children, they have had traumatic experiences which get triggered when such and such happens.
Right. Right. And I would have in the past, I think if I would have said, I'm having PTSD of the alcohol pad.
Yeah.
But I feel like I don't know if what you were saying would be fair. I'd be like, I'm just being triggered. I'm being triggered of a memory. I'm not having I don't know. It's like that PTSD is a very powerful word. And I feel like it's thrown around a lot, but I feel like more it's like I'm getting triggered to that memory.
That would be the better.
You're
better
triggered
way.
Of your trauma.
I'm triggered of my trauma.
And it's someone who truly has PTSD. We would just want to be careful when we use that term.
Right.
Because when someone's really going through that, it's hell. I mean, it's a pretty,
Right.
and not to say you haven't experienced
Right, no.
PTSD,
Yeah.
but we do tend to throw it around a little bit.
Right.
It's really more my guess, because you're pretty high functioning right now.
I
Although
try.
you have had therapy, is that it's the alcohol pads are triggering the trauma of your infertility.
Yeah.
And can we get stuck in fight, flight, or freeze? You know, is it a one-time thing, or can something like infertility over a long period of time keep us, like, can it keep our amygdala over functioning?
So I want to make sure I'm defining it clearly. So it doesn't get stuck.
Okay.
You will come out of it and back into it.
Right.
However, because if you were literally stuck in it all the time, you wouldn't be able to survive it because
Right.
of what's happening in your body. The level of hormones that are being dropped into your body during the fight, flight, or freeze would kill you over time.
Right.
If you were totally always in it. So that doesn't
Right.
happen. You'd go into shock first.
Okay.
Right? That would be your body's response.
Wow.
So, but we can be so sensitive to the triggers around us that we can be in fight, flight, or freeze a lot.
Too much.
Absolutely too much. And what's interesting is especially chronic trauma,
Right.
kids that are abused, for example, they're in fight, flight, or freeze so much of the time, and it really affects brain development
Right.
in kids. They found that the amygdala will grow when it's overused,
Oh, wow.
which is a problem.
Yeah,
Right.
that's a major problem. Yeah.
Right. And do you think infertility is one of those things that is overstimulating the amygdala?
Yes,
Can
yes,
it can,
yes. Now, and
That's
you and I have
just interesting.
spoken.
It's
that
just fascinating.
your level of anxiety that you experienced. You probably were in the fight, flight, or freeze often. And I think what happens, we get so used to it that we're not even aware of it.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So, and it's
fascinating.
really hard on our bodies to be in fight, flight, or freeze. And that's why I'm such an advocate for working out your anxiety and moving towards it and processing that stuff, because it's really hard on our bodies to be in fight, flight, or freeze.
So true.
As we're going through infertility and as we're experiencing all these troubles of growing our family, there are things that come up, I feel like at different times for me and I guess for everyone, there's that initial shock. But if there's traumatic events all the way through, right?
Yes. One of mine was bringing it up to people and having their response be hurtful. That was a very traumatic thing. And I feel like that's a very common thing in infertility, and a very common thing in our community at Uniquely Knitted that we hear all the time is like, you know, when people say things like just relax or just adopt or just have some wine, it's like those things are very hurtful and almost traumatic in itself. How would you say one thing, Annie, in your professional opinion, that would you say that could be helpful for those kind of things or a response?
Well, I think that's an excellent point, because I think the response, community is the most important thing, in my opinion, on dealing with any kind of trauma. But specifically Uniquely Knitted, which you guys are providing, is a community, which I think is so amazing.
Thank you.
So what was the question?
So we were talking about a little bit of this before we went on air. Like, how is it we need our community so bad, but
Yes.
how do we combat their responses?
Okay.
And I think
So-
one thing to add was, I think in the infertility community, we like to trickle truth a little bit of it out. Like, we're not necessarily being fully. So how do you help someone with that?
So for community is the most important thing,
Yes.
and yet community can really hurt us.
Yes.
Right.
And so when, like you said about the trickling out, I thought that was so great, because for whatever reason, many people that are going for infertility, including myself, kept it secret. And maybe there's different reasons for that. That's another topic to explore.
Right.
But and then when you're at your breaking point, then you might just say, tell someone close to you, we've been trying to have a baby for a while.
Yes.
And we're still trying, or just something little, and then we expect them to then respond with, oh my goodness, how are you doing? Just really being there for us and meeting those needs that we need met at that moment. And yet they have no idea the level of pain and suffering that we've already been through. They have no idea how serious of an issue it is and how much we've been through. So it's important to be able to communicate all of our pain and suffering with safe people.
Yes.
So when we share it with some people, they don't know how to handle it. They don't know what to do. They don't know how to deal with it. And so they may say something hurtful. Like,
yes.
I think you just need to relax.
Right.
Then you'll get pregnant.
Right.
I've had that said to me, and it was very painful for me because then it becomes my fault.
Exactly.
Right? I could be doing something to get pregnant.
Exactly.
So that, like you said, can be traumatic in itself. And so we need to, first of all, we need to have a safe community, which is what I think Uniquely Knitted provides, so that we can practice sharing. We can practice sharing our hearts and our suffering and getting a healthy response. And then as we practice, then it's a little bit easier to then share with other people in our lives that may not be as safe, but that we also want to be able to share with. And then sometimes we have to teach them.
Yes.
We have to teach them what we need from them.
Right.
Because we share our hearts does not mean, one, that the person has insight into what that feels like and looks like.
Right.
Not everybody has a certain level of empathy that we might need.
Right.
And some people just want to fix it. And so they have all these great ideas, and it can be hurtful. So sometimes we need to tell people, this is where I am, and this is what I need from you. Sometimes we just need someone to listen to us. Whereas other times we need someone to really give us some guidance because we're so overwhelmed we can't make a decision. And so to be able to be aware of what our needs are and then express what those needs are to people. Because I think most people really do want to say and do the right thing, but they just don't know how.
Yes.
And
we have a lot of that too.
Absolutely.
People coming to us, how do I help my friend? I have no idea what to say. I'm like, don't say anything. I'm just kidding. But just listen. You know what I mean? That's one thing. Or ask them what they need. Yeah. I think one thing too that I've noticed is when you've practiced and you have more people on your team helping you carry the load of your pain, is when you hear those comments, they're not as hurtful. To me, at least.
Right.
Because I had such an army behind me that so backed me up. And I am a hairdresser. So I would hear 8 times a day to relax. Or a big one with us was just adopt and you'll get pregnant. And to me, that was actually really hurtful because that negated our actual diagnosis of like, no, that's actually not going to happen because we have a 1% chance of getting pregnant on our own, and IVF doesn't even work for us. So, but I had such a army of a community behind me that I could roll my eyes to with those comments, be like, I got, 2 just adopt today. I got 1 relax. I got 2 wines. You know what I mean? But it wasn't as hurtful. Right. And I wasn't so bitter against those people. It was more like I looked
more people
because I had my people that I could even text in my day. I could be mixing color and being like, oh, someone just told me this and that was hurtful for me. And then they could be like, oh my gosh, we love you and it's okay. You know what I mean? Or just help me vent it out. Right. And then it left me where I wasn't as bitter at those people for not having the right response. And then sometimes I felt the burden to educate them. They weren't even my safe people, but I still felt the burden to be like, well, that's actually not going to happen for Doug and I, or something like that. Or, sometimes that's not helpful, or this is what I need, but that took a long time. It's one thing to do that with your safest people. And then it's one thing to do to the big, huge community. And sometimes I didn't feel the burden to. I was just like, let me just hear that comment and then you can just go on your way.
Good for
but
you.
It almost started to bounce off me instead of absorb.
Right. That's called resilience. And resilience is
an amazing
thing to develop. We all need to develop resilience. Right. And I think if we can develop resilience, which is a whole nother topic.
Yeah, whole nother topic.
We can then look at the people in our lives, because there's some people in our lives we really want to connect with. We really want them to know our hearts.
Yeah.
And yet there are people who don't know how to respond to emotional things.
Yes.
And so if that's somebody that you love and care about, like an in-law or something, then to be able to say in your mind, you know what? She could be there for me with a recipe, or she could be there for me with, she could help me decorate the living room because that's her talent. Yeah. But she's not going to be able to be there for me with my infertility suffering because she doesn't know how to connect that way, or she doesn't have the psychologically mindedness to be able to be empathic, or to, she wants to fix it. And so therefore she's just going to give you advice. And so for us to be able to look at the people in our lives and understand there's some people who can't meet certain needs, but you can still be in a relationship with them.
Yeah.
But but just being, aware of this person I can rely on for this, but I can't rely on her for that.
Yeah, that's so good. Instead of always expecting that they're going to meet you in your infertility.
And when you do that, you're setting yourself up for disappointment again and again and again.
Yeah. And then that's where a lot of, I feel like, bitterness that we've seen can occur, because you're expecting something out of them that they can't give. Yeah. But they could teach you how to make a mean chocolate chip cookie or something.
Exactly.
But
okay, so when I'm thinking about all of this, I think about myself as we first started infertility. I didn't know anything of what we're talking about right now. I mean, even the words we're using, the level of self-care, I was totally ignorant to. If I was going through something stressful, I, played a video game or I went surfing or something, and it was like gone, like problem gone. I felt it cleared my mind. It was a very simplistic. Before infertility. Yeah. I mean, maybe or even that's how I tried to care for myself during infertility. This feels like if we're talking about infertility as a trauma, we're also talking about introducing into your life a different level of self-care. Would be accurate to say?
Absolutely. I think that's a really well put. We need a higher level of self-care. When we're in a trauma situation, and again, keeping in mind that infertility is an ongoing, difficult, stressful situation,
right?
That we do need a higher level of care because every day we're dealing with it.
Yeah.
And that's true, in other situations in our lives. If we're dealing with a parent with dementia, it's every day we're dealing with it. If we're dealing with a sick child, every day, that it's a totally another level of stress. And so, yes, there needs to be a higher level of care. Going surfing is huge. That's a huge thing for some people.
Yeah, and it still is
and
huge.
It is self-care.
Absolutely.
And so sometimes we have to just take ourselves out of that infertility situation for a little bit and allow ourselves to let that stay, in a box that we put on the shelf just for the weekend.
Right.
And, just like you said, giving people a break. Patrick and I had to take a break because we were so emotionally drained that we decided we have to stop for a bit and get our emotional well-being under control.
Yeah,
right.
And totally.
So
absolutely.
I think that it is a higher level of care. And I think ideally, and this is what I love about what you guys are doing, is that we work on it. The sooner you start working on it, the better. Yeah. Right? Because then you start developing the skills to be able to cope. You start developing resilience and how to have resilience so that you can handle the stress of infertility.
Yeah. It's amazing. Okay, Jesse, takeaway. Infertility and trauma. It's a major thing that comes out of all of what we're experiencing. For you, what's a takeaway from this conversation?
The in-law thing. That's huge to me, of like not expecting, like seeing them for what they are and what they're able to give you, and not have to be expecting something out of that, or whoever it is, doesn't have to be the in-law, or whoever it is, and really seeing them for what they can give. And that when you have people in your corner, that you have safe people and people that are helping you carry the load in a way, the emotional load in a way, that those comments and relax and stuff like that will just, help you be more resilient and have it bounce off. I think that's huge. But I think also we expect everyone to know how to care for us. And I think if we go into, a Thanksgiving or something, it feels like a lot of holidays are around a lot of pain. And, going into it, really viewing it as accurate, and what you're going to receive is really helpful, instead of being like, they should know how to care for me. Like maybe they are not the most empathetic people, or, like a lot of people feel like my family is like, your family has to be your safe people. It's like, not necessarily, you know what I mean? Like,
no, I think sometimes actually family can be harder because we carry baggage with our family. There's history. And so that sometimes can kind of block, because, I think about triggers. Yeah. And you grow up with your family for at least 18 years. There's things that happen that maybe are hurtful, and those are going to get triggered when they respond a certain way that would hurt you, but not me, because I didn't experience the past stuff that triggered it. So,
and they're so emotionally invested in you. They might have a strong reaction of almost being angry, because infertility is so unfair that it's, they might have a stronger reaction, and that's not what you needed. Right. But it's almost like, because they're emotionally invested in you. That's why I loved my therapist so much. Still love her, of like, she was so great to be like, you're not emotional. You're not going to like react out of emotion. You're going to help me try to navigate, because even though I had an awesome community, they were all very protective over me. Mm-hmm. And some things like IVF, you can't protect anyone of that pain. You know what I mean? So you're going to have that emotional component.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, the idea that infertility can create a physiological response even in my body, and that the stress that I'm going through through the adoptions that we had done, even the foster care that we're doing now, that kind of stuff can physiologically put me in a position that hormones are being dumped into my body. And that is, it's not good for me. And two, it just dysregulates my thinking and all of that kind of stuff. That encourages me to care for myself more. You know, it's not just like, you know, just tough it out, or I'll get through this, and, you know, or I just need to go for a walk. All those are good things, and it's true, I will get through it. But it makes me feel like I want to commit to a higher level of self-care, you know, throughout this whole time.
That's your biggest. What would be your biggest takeaway? Is that your biggest takeaway?
Yeah, it's just that infertility creates a reason for a higher level of self-care. And I know that we know that, but I feel like this conversation gave me the groundwork to really stand on that belief.
Great.
Dr. Andrea Ganahl, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, thank you for being here.
That's great.
You're the best. I hope we have you on all the time. And we can be best friends.
I love being with you guys.
Yes, perfect.
We will see you next Monday for another conversation about infertility and feelings.
See you then.
Farewell.